Always look slower.
Good morning. Welcome to Forums That Matter, a community service of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Jean Martin, the chair of the Forum Committee, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on affordable housing, which has both remote and in-person audiences. I have friends in the Cleveland area who recently sold their homes for 30% and more over asking in bidding wars. That's great for them. But what happens to people who are struggling to own or rent for the first time, or trying to move up from their current housing? Rising prices have made this unattainable for many. Some people might say, oh, Cleveland's just catching up to other parts of the country. Our speakers today will tell you it's more than that, and they'll tell you some solutions. After the speakers present, we'll have a Q&A from about 9:30 until a little bit before 10. Debbie will provide a mic for our in-person audience. We ask our virtual audience to put their questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try to work them into the program. Please be sure your phones are off or in airplane mode. This program is recorded and will be available in a few days on our website at uucleveland.org. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers. In February 2022, Sally Martin O'Toole was appointed the City of Cleveland's Director of Building and Housing. For 4 years prior, she was Housing Director for the City of South Euclid and was one of the founders of One South Euclid, the city's affiliate nonprofit community development corporation. She serves on a number of housing policy groups and has held leadership positions for the Vacant and Abandoned Property Action Council, known as VAPAC. Sally is a graduate of the University of Florida. Tim Kobie is a business process analyst with the City of Cleveland's Department of Building and Housing. He is co-chair of the Investor Working Group for VAPAC and was a participant on the Age-Friendly Cleveland Advisory Council. Tim became interested in neighborhood development during his 2 AmeriCorps service terms while attending Case Western Reserve University. He earned a master's in urban planning, design, and development, and a PhD in urban studies and public affairs, with a focus on housing and neighborhood development. Ayonna Blue Donald is Vice President, Ohio Market, the nationwide enterprise community partners. Her work helps Ohioans achieve housing stability and economic mobility. She served as Director of Cleveland's Department of Building and Housing from 2017 to 2021, and most recently was the Chief of Commercial Services and Governmental Affairs for the Department of Port Control. Ayonna earned a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Case and a law degree from the University of San Francisco School of Law. Sally, will you go first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us today. This topic is critically important in our region, and it's something I'm focusing on every day. So in my 14 years in South Euclid, and I know some of you remember me from there, it was such a great position because I was so in touch with what was going on in the neighborhoods, and I was constantly knocking on doors and walking streets to check on people, and especially around tax delinquency. So when we talk about what we're talking about today and Tim's groundbreaking research, which is really something I don't think anyone has done before, we're talking about housing policy issues. And when I put on my housing policy hat, it's more with the Vacant Abandoned Property Action Council, which Jean touched on. So what is that, and how does that differ from our normal day jobs? The Vacant Abandoned Property Action Council is a very ad hoc group. It's a very informal group that's been meeting every single month since 2005 to talk on issues that touch on vacancy, abandonment, and housing instability in our region. So the people that come to these meetings are typically high-level people in government, the Federal Reserve Bank, different educational institutions, and nonprofit groups. So all 3 of us are members of VAPAC, and we're in many ways wearing our VAPAC hat when we talk about these housing policy issues. So the shape-shifting nature of our housing market, which you've all, I'm sure, it's been a wild ride since 2005 and about 2009 when things really fell off the rails. We saw our housing market just completely go in the tank. In South Euclid, where I served for so long, what we were seeing were bungalows in parts of our city in the post-war areas where they built up in the 1950s. Those houses, 3-bedroom, 2-bath bungalows, selling for $30,000, $15,000. Those were the prices we were getting in about 2010, and it was staggering. And shift to today, and what are we seeing on those same streets? We're seeing 190,000. We're seeing 210,000. So we're seeing this incredible rise in prices that isn't necessarily justified by the condition of the properties. So in Cleveland, where I'm now working and serving, we truly have an issue. And Tim is going to give you all of the data that he did. It's really eye-opening, because what's happening is what we intuitively knew was happening on the ground, is that when the prices went into the tank, it was ripe for investors to come in and buy up everything they could. And I'm sure many of you are getting those "we will buy your house for cash" postcards. Perhaps they're even texting you, they're sending you emails, they're harassing you mercilessly to buy your house for cash. Well, why is that? Well, the prices, even though they've escalated, they're still a bargain to many out-of-state and out-of-the-country investors that want to come in and scoop up everything they can. So we're seeing it throughout the region. They're buying houses and then they're renting them for very high prices. And what's been happening more recently, and what was really troubling me when I left South Euclid and came to Cleveland, is tenant displacement that was happening. And it was happening at a widespread level. So just before I left South Euclid, I had a woman who I had worked with over the years in a code enforcement capacity. She was living on one of our neighborhood streets, and she called and said she was being evicted. And she said she had never missed a rent payment. And the issue was the new landlord who came from Southern California was planning to raise her rent by about $400 a month, and she could not afford this. And she was actually receiving, she was a subsidized tenant. She was receiving a CMHA housing choice voucher, and she'd been in that house for 18 years. And she was living there with her sister who had dementia and a grandchild she was raising. And they said, well, if you can't pay it, you need to go. And so she didn't take them seriously because she didn't know what to do. She tried to find other houses. She called me and I said, you've got to start looking. She couldn't find anything. No one would take her voucher. She couldn't go anywhere. And so she was evicted. And they took her, and they came on the day that they said they were going to come, and they took her out of the house, and her sister fell trying to get into the car, and no one cared. You know, she was just tossed out of that house with all of her things left in it. So this is going on every day. So a lot of tenants don't have leases, so they have no protection from their landlords at all. So it's a month-to-month lease, and those landlords are coming in, buying these houses from mom and pops, are often selling because the price appreciation has occurred and they're ready to cash out. So the buy your house people sound really good to them. And these tenants are being left with no opportunities to move. They're just out. Homelessness has increased. You know, we're dealing with a lot of issues, especially in Cleveland with squatting, because as people are tossed out of their rental homes, they're finding vacant homes and going inside of them and trying to live. So we're finding the predatory behavior among landlords is just off the charts. I had a 12-unit apartment building in Collinwood. They had had no working heat for the past 2 seasons. They had had no garbage pickup. They had no water and no electricity, and they were all living in there. So it's a Herculean effort. It's troubling. So the price appreciation, while it looks good on paper, it's scary, because one of the other factors of that is that someone who has, let's say, enough money for an FHA mortgage has absolutely no competitive bidding power in this market. So it's mostly cash buyers buying, and people are being shut out of home ownership opportunities. So what Tim is going to show you, especially on the east side of Cleveland, and of course this disparately impacts Black and brown communities always, as everything does. You know, they're being shut out, they're losing their home ownership, and investors are coming in and controlling rents. So rents in Cleveland have never declined. And in fact, even when people were able to buy houses for $20,000, the rents on those houses were always high. So in South Euclid, average rent was probably $1,250 to $1,300 a month. So someone could buy that house for $20,000, put very little into it, rent it out for $1,200, $1,300 a month. Month-to-month lease. So if anything goes awry, they just non-renew that lease and the individual has to leave. So I think this is something we all need to be aware of. One of the initiatives we're trying to do in Cleveland, it's multiple really, but we're working on legislative changes to hold investors more accountable for their properties, because one of the problems we have is LLC ownership, which Tim's going to talk about. These are business owners. They hide behind LLC. It's like a veil, you know. When we prosecute code enforcement violations, we have to prosecute them criminally, which gives us a higher standard to get somebody in court. We have to absolutely serve them properly with certified mail notice. And how do we do that when somebody is in Israel or they're in Australia? It's really, really difficult. And so we need different tools in the toolbox than we've used in the past for code enforcement. So we've formed a group with the Vacant Abandoned Property Action Council, this ad hoc group of stakeholders, to look at our legislation, to propose changes, and to start implementing those changes. We also have an opportunity that we're working on with Ayonna around state forfeiture. So when properties go through tax foreclosure, and we know here in Cuyahoga County, we have about 32,000 tax delinquent parcels. So oftentimes those are moving through the tax foreclosure process. And those will end up at times on the state of Ohio forfeited lands inventory. If they are they try to sell them a sheriff's sale twice. If they do not sell, they default to state of Ohio forfeited lands inventory, which means that a county land bank or a city land bank can pull those for their inventory. In the past, most cities have never taken anything from the forfeited lands inventory with a structure on it. They would often take vacant land and tuck it into their land banks for future redevelopment. We're looking at taking some structures now. And why is that? Because we want to produce units for affordable home ownership. These are being lost, and if we have the power to control some of that real estate, we want to take it so that we can put these units back out and help people become homeowners, or at least sustainable renters without predatory landlords coming in. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I want Tim's data to be the star of the show. So I think you're going to find it incredibly eye-opening.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started here. Okay, so as Sally mentioned, VAPAC was looking at investor activity in the real estate market. And the way that I tend to approach a problem is you listen to what's happening in the community. So in this case, when Sally was at South Euclid, she was saying, this is what I'm seeing in South Euclid. We had CDCs coming to us and saying, this is what we're seeing in our neighborhood. And that got me thinking, well, we can probably figure this out with data. We can find the data to help back up what community advocates are seeing on the ground. So what I did is I said, well, how can we figure out if there's more investor activity in Cleveland? So what I did is I just looked at the property transfers in Cuyahoga County, figured out who the buyer was, and I went ahead and categorized it into, I think I ended up with 7 categories. But the most important category was businesses that were buying 1 through 3 family homes. So in that case, I knew that was an investor. Business can't reside in a house. So a business was an investor. And then in this case, what I did is I compared those to individual buyers. So typically that would be an owner occupant, but the data didn't allow me to necessarily distinguish between Tim buying a house to live in it versus Tim buying it to rent it out or rehab it. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy there with our individual buyers, but as you'll see when we look at the business buyers, that data really shows us that there's this big increase in investor activity in Cuyahoga County. So I went back to 2004 because I wanted to look at what happened before the foreclosure crisis. because I knew that kind of really jumbled up the market in 2008, 2009. So I wanted to see what was happening before that, during, after, and then now to today. So you can see in the graph here where everybody was in 2004. And the east side of Cleveland was the highest at like 15 or 16% business acquisitions. Everybody else was below 10%. I think probably like 7-8% was the highest that we saw. So then as we move into 2008, you can see there's this increase in businesses acquiring 1 through 3 family properties. The highest activity is the east side of Cleveland. Keep in mind, this is 90% African American. And then we also see an increase in the east inner suburbs, also majority African American. And then also on the west side of Cleveland, we see this increase during the foreclosure crisis. The increase is absent in the west inner suburbs and the outer suburbs for the foreclosure crisis. So then as we move out of the foreclosure crisis, you can kind of see there's this cooling off period where investors are kind of leaving the market. So those are the people that were buying those, groups of 200 properties, and they were just flipping it to somebody else, getting whatever they could. But in 2012, when the market recovers, we again see this big increase. The biggest increase again, east side of Cleveland. It goes from probably 18-19% all the way up above 45% of property acquisitions or to businesses in 2020. And this increase happens across the board. So the west inner suburbs and outer suburbs, where you didn't really see investor activity prior to 2012, you see this increase. So it goes from like 5% up above 10%, and then it kind of levels off here in 2020. Same thing again, east inner suburbs, we see this big increase, 17-18%, up it touches 30% of property acquisitions or businesses. West side of Cleveland, slightly less than that. We're looking at about 25% of properties are going to businesses in 2020. So one thing to think about for this is if you're an individual buyer, if you have, you got your financing, you got your mortgage, you're looking for your first home, you're going out there, if you're on the east side of Cleveland, you're competing with all these businesses buying for, they're going to buy it and rent it out, or they're going to buy it and hopefully rehab it. So you have to compete against all those businesses when you go to buy. Now, we know when you come with a mortgage and you're looking at a property you want to own, you're probably going to want an inspection to make sure the house is okay. Businesses, they're coming with cash. They don't care about an inspection. They're just going to offer cash, no inspection, just, let's do the transaction right here. So it makes it really hard for first-time home buyers, or really any home buyer, to compete in these markets where you're seeing this huge increase in investor activity. But investor activity isn't necessarily bad, right? We need investor activity. There's houses that an individual isn't able to fix up. So we want investors to come in and fix up houses to rent out or to sell to owner occupants. So I kind of thought, well, how can we tell what's going on with investors? So I think the one easy data point that I had was price data. And so what I did is I just picked the 3 time periods that seemed to make most sense based on the data. So 2004, which is our baseline, 2012, which is where we saw that increase start again, and then 2020, which was the most recent year I had data for. And you can see east side of Cleveland, west side of Cleveland, businesses are buying at half or less of what individuals are. Similar case for east inner suburbs, and then there's less of a discount for business buyers in the west inner suburbs and outer suburbs. Then you can see how prices crash. 2012 was kind of a bottom for prices, result of foreclosure crisis. And then going into 2020, you can see the increase that we're starting to see in prices again. But where you're not seeing that increase in prices on the east side of Cleveland. And what's really troubling is businesses and individuals are basically buying at the same price point. So that kind of makes you wonder how many of those individual buyers on the east side of Cleveland are investors themselves. So we can keep moving. So this was an idea to get at like what's the quality of housing that businesses are buying versus individuals. And that discount in price makes you think that they're buying lower quality housing. So to confirm that, before we confirm it, we're just going to look real quick at the difference between the east side and west side for the city of Cleveland. And you can see where we were pre-foreclosure crisis. East side and west side were about the same price. So when you go back here, same price for individuals, and then we get this huge drop. And the biggest drop is the east side of Cleveland there. We're dropping down, you can see $10,000 at one point, what was the median price people were buying at. And then as the market recovers here in Cleveland, you can really see that individual buyers and business buyers on the east side of Cleveland kind of ran together. So again, that kind of made me question, how many individual buyers on the east side are investors themselves. And on the west side, you see this recovery that looks more like rest of the county. So again, lower price points make you think that quality is less. So can we confirm this? So in 2015, Western Reserve Land Conservancy did a survey of the entire city of Cleveland, and they graded properties A through F. So for the transactions in 2015, I matched that with the grade that TCI gave. So what we can see is individuals on the west side of Cleveland are buying largely in the A and B area. The low quality transfers are happening on the east side of Cleveland. But again, if you look at the percentages, there's not a lot of difference between businesses and individuals. So again, how many buyers on the east side of Cleveland, individual buyers, are they themselves investors? So again, we'll look at, so TCI did a second survey in 2018 of east side neighborhoods. So what we can see here is that the good news is that the purchases at that low end of the market, the D and the F properties, those lowered. But the bad news is that businesses, instead of kind of staying in that D and F area, they're starting to creep into the B and Cs. So again, when we look at the graph and we think, who are you competing with if you're an individual buyer? So now these businesses are starting to kind of move up the chain of housing quality. So they're starting to get into that market where most of our individuals were buying before. This looks at those D and F properties that I was talking about. So I looked at properties that had a recent board up. In the city of Cleveland, a property is boarded up if it's open, vacant, or vandalized. That means it's open to casual entry. So front doors kicked in, front windows are knocked out, that sort of thing. So typically those are our properties that are in the worst condition. So initially when I did this, I looked at the percentage and I said, oh, this is great news. You look at the purple line, it's going down. They're buying fewer and fewer distressed properties. But then when I looked at the totals, it actually just told me that businesses are buying more properties overall. So when you have your numerator and your denominator, it really just meant that businesses were more active in the market overall. So this just kind of shows you where the distressed sales are occurring in the city of Cleveland. And based on the data that we saw, they're occurring in Glenville, Mount Pleasant, Union Miles, Broadway Slog Village, and then we have this little cluster on the west side that we're familiar with. And this is one of those maps that really looks like most of the maps in the city of Cleveland. Am I doing okay on time? So buying distressed property isn't necessarily problematic, right? We want investors to buy property, fix it up, rent it out, rehab it. So what I did here is I looked at permits to see what was happening with permits, because this is going to give us an idea of who's fixing up property. So I looked at construction permits and I looked at building permits. So a construction permit would include a building permit, but it would also be like electrical, plumbing, HVAC, that sort of thing. And when you look at what's happening east side versus west side, individuals on the west side are pulling permits about the same rate as businesses and individuals on the east side of Cleveland. Businesses on the west side are pulling permits at a higher rate. So that makes me think that the businesses, the investors on the west side are fixing up property more often than businesses or individuals on the east side. And that's problematic based on that quality data that we've seen before. I was concerned though that we were seeing a lot of electrical permits on the east side of Cleveland. So you buy a house that doesn't have electricity, you have to pull an electric permit. We come out, we check the meter, make sure it's okay, or the panel. Our inspector says, yes, the panel's good. CEI or CPP, they turn the power on, you're good to go. A lot of times an investor will buy a property, no electricity, they just simply turn the electric on and move a tenant right in. So I was concerned about that. So that's why I looked only at building permits. And here we can see another troubling trend. Building permits are pulled only about 4% of the time on the east side versus 8% for businesses on the west side. And even individuals on the west side are pulling permits at a higher rate than on the east side. So that investment that we were expecting to see isn't necessarily happening at the rate we want to see it happen. And this is just to map it out to kind of see what's happening. So you can see overall permits is going to be on the left there. And then when you take out those electrical, HVAC, those kind of permits, most of our activity is happening on the near west side, Detroit Shoreway, Ohio City. So when I looked at the permit data, I was like, well, maybe these properties aren't in that bad a condition. Maybe they can just buy and move somebody in. So one of the ways that we can gauge compliance for landlords is to look at, are they registering their rentals? And the good news is that over time, they're starting to register rentals more often. The bad news is it's only about 28% on the east side and 23% for new landlords. So that kind of tells us they're not really complying with rental registration, which obscures it from rental inspection, and it also obscures it from the lead registry. So this led me to, I think I have 6 conclusions, but I'll see here. So the percentage of buyers of 1 to 3 family homes that are acquired by a business increased substantially from 2004 to 2020. The most impacted submarkets are east side of Cleveland and east inner suburbs. Businesses are tending to buy at the lower end of the market. That tells us that they're buying lower quality housing. East side Cleveland housing prices have not recovered from the foreclosure crisis. Distressed sales are occurring most often on the east side of Cleveland. So we kind of, again, we're wondering how many individual buyers on the east side are they themselves investors. Construction permits are being issued throughout the city, but only on about 10% of sales. And businesses are registering their purchases as rentals more often in 2019 than in 2017, but overall it's only about 20% over the last 3 years. So that leads us to less than three less than ideal scenarios. So businesses are speculating or otherwise holding property vacant without improving it through legal rehab. Businesses are renting out property without registering it, like I said before, obscuring it from the rental inspection process in the lead registry, or businesses are renovating property without pulling permits, throwing into question quality of work. So what this really tells us is that we have this subset of investors who really aren't investing the way that we think of investing, right? They're not putting money into a property. All they're doing is they're extracting value from the property, whether that's through rent with a tenant in there or them just simply flipping it. They're not actually putting money into these properties. So from there, we kind of work to figure out, well, what are the policy solutions for that? And that's what Ayonna is going to talk about.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. And I want to say, because Sally, you mentioned VAPAC, but I want to also mention just how important VAPAC and another group, County Housing Stakeholders Group, which I will cite some information from a report that was just released this week. VAPAC really rang the alarm at a point at the foreclosure crisis, at the height of that crisis, to say we have a problem in our city, right? With predatory lending and how it affected us, it was very drastic. We are still recovering on some parts of our community. And I feel that this work that Tim has done, it really should be ringing another alarm for us in our community, not just Cleveland, but I'll also mention some statistics for Cuyahoga County as well. And I'll keep it brief because I really want to hear questions, or we all do, from the group and from the online community. But keeping in mind that Cleveland generally is the epicenter of housing issues that happen throughout the country. So if you hear us talking about what is happening in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, this is happening throughout the country. It's fairly often that VAPAC representatives are quoted in the New York Times, our research and data are included for what is happening, because it is definitely a magnifying glass for what is happening across our country. So as I mentioned, there's a group, County Housing Stakeholder Groups, which has about over 20 county housing experts, people that are really in this industry to say, let's get together and let's figure out what are the problems here. In 2017, that group got together and said, we're going to put together a county housing plan. 2019, the county government decided to implement that through their county housing program. But now with the upcoming county executive change, we thought this was prime time to update that and refresh it. So we did a lot of digging and research and talking to our stakeholders, referencing data that Tim mentions and a couple of other data experts here in our county to say, what should be our policy pushes to kind of improve this issue here? I'll go over very quickly overview of what these are, and hopefully you guys can ask some questions to us just to kind of dig in. One is increasing resources for housing stability. Keeping in mind that we are talking, one of the issues he mentions is just the housing quality of our properties here, that low wages and increasing housing costs leads to housing instability. It compounds. None of these issues are really, we can look at them on their own. Reducing the barriers to housing. Just yesterday, I heard our HUD Secretary, Marsha Fudge, say that senior population is the highest growing population for homelessness, only seconded by families with children. How can we reduce barriers to people that may be seniors, that may be returning home from incarceration, that have families, et cetera, to make sure they have access to housing? That then doubles down with strengthening our fair housing laws in our community. So landlords won't be able to discriminate against these special populations that I just speak of to make sure they have housing. And equitably invest in our housing markets. And I think that's really key to Tim's data when we think about how can we kind of turn this around. When you look at investors and the LLCs are coming into our community, they're essentially eroding the ability for homeowners to be able to buy or purchase an affordable home. But how can that happen, or how can we help and assist? One way to help and assist that is really for our banks and financial institutions to provide different financial products to our community for people to be able to purchase and afford homes that LLCs are essentially just coming in and swooping in and getting them, right? Most mortgage lenders, they only want to lend $50,000 and above, but if a certain part of our community, the property values aren't quite there, banks can't even loan. So that puts you in a cash position where investors are significantly favored, right? And outnumber what our community members can actually provide. Also, one way of investing equitably in our housing markets is having different capital products to be able to support home repair. This is very crucial to stabilize our community and make sure that our properties are still affordable in the sense that people can still live in them. People can remain in place. Seniors can age in place. Our community can stay stable where they are, as opposed to investors coming in with their sources of capital and then being able to rehab and repair properties with the snap of a finger, where we cannot do that and where our homeowners cannot do that. There's plenty of stats I can go over, but we have about 20 minutes, it appears, for questions. So I'll state my comments and.
Thank you, Sally, Tim, and Ayonna, for sharing your expertise with us today. It really opens my eyes when I look at the transfers, the real estate transfers, and know what those prices were before and after. So I'll now turn our Q&A session over to Debbie, who will pass the mic to you. And again, if you're at home watching, put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to them.
Good morning. Thank you for an excellent presentation, very stimulating, and your research is admirable. I was raised on the east side of Cleveland, 127th, and was at that time Woodland Avenue, now called Larchmere. And I've gone back to my street for Porch Fest on a number of occasions. And it's amazing how the area has become kind of yuppified. I mean, it's academics from Case Western Reserve, it's nurses and people from the Cleveland Clinic, just a short ride down the hill. They have an association, and it seems to me to be a template for successful rebuilding of housing properties in Cleveland. Would you care to comment on that?
I can comment a little bit on that because I work a lot with Chip Bromley from Ohio Fair Lending, and Chip's organization over there did a lot for Larchmere in terms of, you got a big cash settlement, I think, when Ohio Savings pulled the branch out of there.
Right.
They did a strategic plan. They created a special improvement district, merchants association that really helped. So I would probably say, though, that even though Larchmere is more stable, it's definitely not gentrifying in any meaningful way. I mean, they still have suppressed values and they still have a lot of issues. But you're right, the homeowners have gotten together and they have patrols of security officers that go through that area to augment what Cleveland police are able to do over there to keep the neighborhood safe. But right down the street on South Moreland, we have a very big issue with some of the apartment buildings being sold to out-of-state, out-of-country investors, and a lot of craziness going on. So while it's a bright light, Larchmere, I think the whole area as a whole is a big area of focus for me in code enforcement.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carmen Hall. I'll give you a little bit of background about me. I was a Cleveland police officer, and at some point we were tasked to do housing code enforcement. It got so overwhelming for the courts from them trying to find LLCs till they just told us to stop it. I was raised in Cleveland in the Lee Harvard area. And as a police officer, I was a community engagement officer, so I'm very much community. I have real estate in the city of Cleveland on the east side. I've had my tenants for a very long time, and I'm very concerned about them because they are poor working tenants, but they are very good tenants. And I am very grateful that this year only I got inspections of my property. I was, I'm like, things are changing. So I thank you for that. And I just want to, I only have limited resources, and I am here to see about maybe financing for the upkeep of my property so I can keep my houses affordable. And my question, how do you plan on, or do you have any idea about the legislation that you're going to try to change to find these LLC companies?
We had much better success in South Euclid holding LLCs accountable, but it was a slight tweak to the legislation that allowed us to do that. So we held agents in charge responsible for property maintenance condition, and we could take them to court. We don't do that in Cleveland, but we're going to start doing that in Cleveland. But we're also exploring civil remedies. So for instance, we can do a receivership on a property that is completely out of control. Like some of the units on South Moreland, they're larger buildings that are just in complete disrepair. And so we've been talking with the law department about employing civil remedies like receivership, where we'll come in and appoint a receiver to take over that building, make needed repairs, collect rents, and then they would take their lien as a receiver and file a foreclosure on that building. So we're going to try to gain control of some of those buildings that way. But one of the bright spots right now, because of the pandemic funding through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan dollars, the city of Cleveland got quite a lot of money from ARPA, and some of that's going to be rolled out, $50 million of it for home repair, gap funding to do projects, and also developer working capital to help small developers who want to work and rebuild their neighborhoods have the capital to do that, because right now there's no source of that other than hard money lenders and predatory products that are out there. So one, we don't want to take the focus off the banks either, because we know banks need to start lending in these communities, and they've essentially redlined a large part of the east side. So that, I get on my soapbox about that quite frequently, and Ayonna was talking about that a little bit too.
And if I can just plug, because you mentioned that you're a landlord, and Tim also briefly mentioned it, is the lead certification requirement in the city of Cleveland. And so one other thing that Enterprise does is we lead the Lead Safe Cleveland Coalition, our partners at the city, to really support the city. So there is a function of that there are grants and loans available to landlords and homeowners, all homeowners and all landlords, regardless of income. We just changed the eligibility in September. So no matter what your income is, you will qualify for a loan or a grant to do repairs on your property. So definitely, I can give you my information if that's something you're interested in. If you haven't complied with the lead law yet, there are incentives of what as well, if you have already complied, that just give you back essentially a certain dollar amount if you've already paid. So there are things that are happening and brewing because we understand that there's such a burden on our landlords.
There's going to be an unprecedented amount of money on the street pretty soon, probably by next spring.
Wow.
Okay, I own my house, but I wondering, she mentioned there was some grants, and when I was looking, it was kind of like income based. So what are the ones that not income based?
The grant that I'm speaking of is specifically for lead repair. So if your property has lead hazards in them, all rental properties have to be free of lead hazards as pertained by ordinance. But if you're interested, so those type of repairs would be, could be window replacement. If you have a window that is scraping when you open it up and down and there's peeling and chipping paint, that can create a lead hazard. Or it could be painting if you have some peeling interior paint or exterior, if you may have porch issues, etc. But this is only for City of Cleveland residents if you live in the city.
Oh, no.
Okay. However,
Yeah, I was going to say, there's more product. Go ahead,
No,
finish
go
what
ahead.
you were saying. I was going to say there's a new loan product that's going to be coupled with grants, and it's administered from the Home Repair Resource Center. It was formerly called the Challenge Loan, which was only available to Cleveland Heights residents, but that product's being expanded countywide. So again, that would be a good place to check. It's a nonprofit called the Home Repair Resource Center, and through a lot of stakeholder pressure, Key Bank is allowing this to be rolled out countywide. So it's sort of I would call it a loan loss reserve product. So we're able to lend to people that might not have normally been able to get home improvement loans. And I also know that they have about $750,000 in grant money that they're going to couple with that right now.
Okay, is that the Key Bank you said?
Yeah, but a Home Repair Resource Center is a nonprofit housing counseling agency out of Cleveland Heights, and that would be a good place to check for that.
Okay, it's North Randall. I live in North Randall.
Yes, you could talk to them, call them up, and find out what would be entailed for your taking advantage of some of that.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, that's exactly. Nope.
Hi. My name's Emily Koritz. I live in South Euclid.
Yes.
Yeah. I heard that there was a state legislator from Cincinnati who proposed some legislation that would require businesses to wait, or cash offers to wait for, first it was 60 days, then it was 45 days before they closed, so to give individuals the opportunity to bring in offers that weren't cash. Is that still going on?
It's Senator Blessing out of South Ohio. Yeah, it's still pending and hasn't passed the State House, we hope. He's a Republican legislator, so the only way we can get anything done at the State House is through a Republican, sadly, but we do have a sponsor in Senator Blessing. So this refers to public auction properties. This is not normal real estate properties. So this is when something is going to sheriff's sale and it's being auctioned. Right now, we have an unfortunate online auction process, which we all were cringing about. The state mandated all sheriff sales be brought online, which allows for out-of-state, out-of-the-country investors to bid. So Senator Blessing is proposing that there is like a waiting period where normal folk can bid for these properties and have a shot at it before the vultures swoop in, so to speak.
Essentially.
Hi, I recently heard a kind of talk about the government accountability when it comes to housing. And they emphasize that there are so many different levels of government. There's the ward leaders in Cleveland, there's the city establishments that have to do with housing. There's the county levels, and then you have state issues that get involved in housing, and then there's federal housing, CNHA or whatever. So I was very confused by the end of the presentation about which did what for who and with what results. So just, I don't know the answer to this, which is simplification of all of these processes that get legal very quickly, and the funding that can be up or down or somewhere in between that has a tremendous impact. So it's just, when you think of the ordinary person living in Huff or wherever, trying to make sense of all of this, and maybe going to their ward leader or whatever, is there any way to simplify these issues that have to do with overlapping and funding and political elections and government entities?
Can I answer that question?
Uh-huh.
Since I'm not in the government anymore.
Yes.
So maybe I can be a little bit more transparent. So I would agree, right? To the average person, it is very hard to kind of navigate the system. Who's doing what? And sometimes you get bounced around and you call people and you say, I don't, who to get kicked around. But I think is it really, I propose, is it really a way to simplify? Sometimes that's hard because federal government has jurisdiction over certain types of funds and it trickles down. Code enforcement generally is at a city level. County maybe may do some funding, throughout the county to certain cities. But I beg to say that really what it is good coordination, right, between all of them. So to you, it can be a little bit more seamless in the sense of making sure that our city, county, state, that sometimes get difficult depending on who's, at the governorship, but at the federal level as well, that we are all marching to the same beat, right? There are encouraging things coming out of the federal level from HUD that are right in line with what I think most of our urban cores are really struggling to tackle, like some issues. So that is promising. Sometimes there's a small glimmer with a lot of pushing at our state level, but also for our county governments and our city governments to be working hand in hand, as opposed to one person saying, hey, this is my priority, or these are my priorities, in the county level saying something completely different. So I think that is really key to getting success, is making sure that we're all aligned. Most big problems that we see tackled in our communities are through some collaborative effort. It's not just one group or entity working on it alone. We have to all come together. So I'm very inspired by, if I can specifically say with these two sitting here, them working in the administration side, the new city of Cleveland's administration and the mayor, how open he's been to collaborating with pick a person or pick a group or pick an entity. I think that's a very good step in the right direction to kind of break down these silos that we all seem to operate in.
I think we're really lucky too to have Marcia Fudge as the HUD secretary, and also to have Sherrod Brown as the banking chair. These are people who get it 100%. And Mayor Bibb just said the other day, I'm having breakfast with Marcia Fudge. Is there anything I should say to her? Like, let me type something up, please. Yeah, so I think they're on board, and I think we have probably a really great opportunity to be more coordinated, as Ayonna said.
So sort of two questions. One is tax equity laws that require communities to have equitable taxes, even if in the face of gentrification. So the original housing taxes are raised as the community becomes gentrified. And then there's all these tax incremental districts where we give lots of money to investors such as Bell Oaks there in Richmond Heights, where they're going to be building luxury apartments. And where is their responsibility to give low-income housing within those luxury developments, subsidized housing of some sort, like a percentage of housing units that should be cheaper and affordable? So it's two questions, but you can do whatever you want with it.
Well, I'll answer the first question because I think a lot about, as it applies back to our topic here, affordability with taxing. So if you've been living in a certain community, let's just say block, right? And you've been living there for 30 years, and then now all the properties are just, selling for triple of what you paid, and so your taxes are increasing. There is a group, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress actually is really leading that effort with the property tax working relief group, I think is the name of the group. And it should be, I don't know if it was introduced, but will be introduced fairly soon, a proposed legislation to stop this, right? To be able to give some type of relief to our property owners, specifically our seniors, that are facing this issue. And so freezing taxes for a certain amount of years, I think it's 6, maybe is what's being proposed now, and then every 6 years you have to reapply. Fairly similar, I guess, to the homestead exemption, but just in the sense that it freezes your assessed value.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't have the increase.
Yeah, you wouldn't have the increase as associated with all the other market values going on around you. Highly critical. Now, I'll go back to another group. I don't want to even throw out the name because I throw out the name of a couple other groups, but just know that people are paying attention. In the city of Cleveland, for years, this group worked very, very hard to say our tax abatement laws have to match or force, ultimately, developers, people that are taking advantage of free tax for 15 years, like a tax abatement for 15 years, to say, okay, if you want tax abatement in our community, then you're going to have to give a set aside of a certain amount of units for low income individuals. Or if you don't do that, fine, then you're going to pay $20,000, I think is the amount that was settled on per unit. So if you build 100 units in the city of Cleveland of luxury apartments in its different zones, I won't go into the details, but legislation was passed just this year that specifically contemplated that issue. Because absolutely, there are certain neighborhoods that units are coming up, developments are coming up that do not set aside anything, that do not include affordable units. And some communities are turning into very lopsided as far as who's living there and what type of people can afford to live there. But that is really a push for municipalities to kind of figure that out for themselves and figure out their tax abatement.
Does it have any Republican support? It's so uncapitalistic, you know?
Well, it's
Well,
local, yeah.
Yeah, the one in Cleveland, local definitely, but the one downstate, the property tax relief actually does. And I can't remember who's sponsoring it.
Patton.
Yes.
Senator Patton is sponsoring it. It's a pretty watered down bill, to be honest. It's a start, but it was probably the only palatable way for them to pass some sort of tax relief that way. But it's going to have local control at the core. So each area, each taxing district will be able to decide what they're doing. But I think it's a huge, important step.
We have an online question that I'd like to ask from Nina. You've kind of touched on this, but I'll tell you what she asks. What about the possibility of federal local legislation to rein in LLCs, especially foreign investors?
I'm hopeful, you know, with Sherrod Brown completely getting it and having multiple Senate hearings about outside, out of state, out of country investors and institutional investors. I think there's hope for the first time for that, but we'll see. You know, will he have bipartisan support? It's hurting every neighborhood in the country, though. It's not just in Cleveland, but we're always the canary in the coal mine, and we always see everything here first. So there's a chance.
So thanks again, everyone. I'm really glad that you could join us today. Next week, our forum will be Financial Challenges of Healthcare with Donna Graham and Kinsey Jolliffe, both financial experts from the Metro Health System. You're welcome to attend our 10:15 service today, either upstairs in the sanctuary or online on our YouTube channel if you're still at home in your pajamas. The theme of our services this week is courage, and today's sermon by Reverend Randy Pertain is the courage to fail. To see what else is happening in our congregation, check out our website at uucleveland.org. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day. And go Guardians!
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I did want to say.